diversity of diasporic populations. And I'm delighted to be joined by three outstanding speakers who are building empathy and understanding through their work. And I'll introduce them individually, and each one can come up and take a seat. I'll begin with Lynn Chen. Lynn is the program coordinator with the Vancouver Art Gallery. She's been associated with the Institute for Asian Art for a decade. Lynn is also co-founder of Scene Evolution, which promotes intercultural engagement through film and media arts. She's a graduate of Emily Carr University of Art and Design, and welcome, Lynn. Thank you for being here. And we're also joined by Denise Fong. Denise is curator of urban cultures at the Museum of Vancouver, and at MOV she was curatorial lead on Mirage, disused public property in Taiwan, and co-curator of A Seat at the Table, which is a major MOV exhibition. She's also co-curated Burnaby Village Museums across the Pacific exhibition, and Denise has a PhD from UBC in interdisciplinary studies. Welcome, Denise. And our third distinguished speaker is Sarah Ling. Sarah is the Exhibitions and Collections Manager at the Chinese Canadian Museum, which just won a major award yesterday. And I'm going to ask Sarah about it so she can explain. But it's the Governor General's Award. It's the top museum award in Canada. So congratulations to everyone at the Chinese Canadian Museum for that. Sarah co-curated and managed several of the museum's inaugural exhibitions. They include Odysseys in Migration and Reshaping Collections, Where History Meets Art. She also worked on the wonderful historic period rooms at the Wing Sang building, which is on East Pender Street, where the museum is housed. Sarah has a master's degree in interdisciplinary studies from UBC. So welcome to our panel, Sarah. And to make this more inclusive, some of it will be conducted in Mandarin if Lynn and Denise are up to, but they don't have to if they're feeling exhausted, because what we can do is this will be on video, and we will have subtitles on the when the VPL puts it up, so it will be bilingual in that regard. Okay, so let's begin. Now you press the button to make sure the green light is on, and then you can talk, and then it'll be recorded. So maybe I'll have the three of you pass the mic along, if that's okay. So maybe I'll start just with an introduction and ask everyone on the panel to share how they became interested in their fields. And you're holding the mic, Denise, so I'll ask you if you can tell us about your personal journey and what led you into the world of museum exhibitions.
Okay. So my name is Denise, and my background is in anthropology and archaeology. So I did my undergraduate and master's at UBC. And for a number of years, I've been working more focused on archaeology in China. And after finishing my master's degree, I was looking for work, and I ended up working in Vancouver in an architect studio that focused on museum exhibition design. And so that kind of became my early entry point into working in museums. And later on, I became very involved with the Initiative for Chinese Canadian Historical Research at UBC, which does a lot of work researching and understanding and building connections with the Chinese Canadian community. So that's how I kind of became more focused in kind of developing some research expertise in that area. And that also became a way in which I started to become engaged with some local museums, because a lot of museums in the kind of past decade have been trying to become more diversified, both in terms of their staffing, but also the stories that they represent. So that's how I kind of became involved in museums, and it kind of went from there.
Okay, that's wonderful. And Lynn, you're at the art gallery. How did you wind up
How
there?
did I end up there? That's a good question. So I guess because my background is in graphic design, that's how I graduated. So I'm always interested in this ideas of how like culture shapes, and then how it shapes the community and the way we behave, the way we think. And so 2008, I co-founded Sing Evolution with two other colleagues, Ian Wang and Rachel Fan. And then that time really wanted to bring films that talks about the contemporary Asia that it's somehow lacking here, the mainstream. And then that sort of got me involved with the work that I do with the Richmond Art Gallery as a community outreach coordinator there. So in 2014, when the gallery established Institute of Asian Art, a speaker that I work with reached out to me and say, hey, we have this position sort of open. Do you mind just spread the words for me? And I say, actually, I'm interested in applying for this job. And just because that time, Zhen Shentian, he's a renowned scholar and a bridge builder for connecting contemporary Chinese art scene in here, and then really is a person that I admire so much. And then so I really wanted to take the opportunity to be able to work with him and the team, and then be part of this really emerging initiative that time. And that's how I became working at the gallery.
Okay, that's wonderful. And Sarah, I'll ask about your journey and how that brought you to the Chinese Canadian Museum.
Well, I don't have any formal museum training, but in my undergraduate degree, I did a major in English literature with a minor in First Nation studies. And so I think English literature was my initial portal into Chinese Canadian history and also Indigenous oral tradition. I always gravitated towards novels written by Chinese Canadian and Indigenous authors. But as I stayed on campus at the University of British Columbia, I got involved on many storytelling initiatives, both in Chinese Canadian studies and Indigenous studies, and decided to spend my master's degree looking at the intersection between our communities. I grew up in Prince Rupert, BC. Majority of the population is First Nations, and so that intersection really intrigued me. And when I got to meet Elder Larry Grant from Musqueam and his family based here in Vancouver, I learned about the Chinese farms that are on the Musqueam Reserve. And so that sort of was the catapult for many projects to follow. I also crossed paths with Denise a long time ago and was part of the UBC Instruct team working on projects. But all that to say that through storytelling and filmmaking, the Chinese Canadian Museum came to me when the opportunity arose a few years ago.
That's wonderful. I'm going to ask you to pass the mic to Lynn for the next question. Lynn, we could just move it down. In the last census, 53.5% of the city of Vancouver's population was described, and this is by Statistics Canada, as visible minority, which makes the entire cohort a visible majority, and that's Vancouver. And the largest group was people with Chinese ancestry, which accounted for about 25%. And Lynn, I'm curious how the Vancouver Art Gallery in recent years has been responding to the growing diversity of the population, and particularly for people from Asia.
Yeah, so we noticed the shift, and I think Joanne's here can verify that. The shift of demographic and really the unique location of Vancouver itself, it's just, we are on the Pacific Rim, and there could be a lot of exchanges. And that is the reason why 10 years ago we established Institute of Asian Art to really formalize the directions, because since the 80s or even before that, we've been collecting and showing a lot of arts from Asia, but just it's never a formal way. And then last night, we just celebrate our 10th anniversary.
Let's give them an applause.
Thank you. And then we announced a new name, actually, and a new direction. So the IAA, Institute of Asian Art, will become the Centers for Global Asias with an S. So it is a platform that we're looking into, like, crystallizing and providing and sharing new understandings of modern and contemporary Asian art, and then thought as well. And then the reason why you use S, Pro, at the end, because Asia itself, there's a lot more diversity, because often when we talk about Asia, we often just situate it as like East Asian only. But so we decided to add Proism to complicate the identity within Asia too.
Well, it also seems the BAG has been doing exhibitions that reflect that. Like, I think a part of is Tanaboli, or
Yes.
there have been lots of everything from artists by people of Filipino ancestry, Korean, Chinese. Yeah. Okay, and Denise, in terms of the Museum of Vancouver, what are some of the landmark exhibitions that have helped reflect the diversity of diasporic populations?
Well, I'm quite new to the Museum of Vancouver. I've been there for a year officially as a staff person, but before I joined as a full-time staff, I was also working on a project called A Seat at the Table, Chinese Immigration in British Columbia, which was a very innovative multi-sited exhibition. So it was actually located at the Museum of Vancouver, as well as at the former location of the Chinese Canadian Museum. So before it moved to the permanent location it is at today, we were able to set up a pocket gallery, and then later on to the kind of temporary space in Chinatown, and be able to tell different stories about Chinese Canadian experiences throughout BC. So it was part of I think the understanding when we created the exhibition that it should tell a much broader story of the complicated journeys and networks of Chinese Canadian experiences. So not just focus on telling the story of Vancouver, but thinking about as well the networks throughout BC, throughout Canada, as well as across the Pacific Ocean. So that is one of the exhibitions in which we, myself, when I was working there, is more in the capacity of a graduate student, leading a lot of the research that was taking place in the kind of production of content and the curatorial approach for the exhibition, was to really try to build a very interdisciplinary type of exhibition where we brought together a lot of local historians, students, activists, and designers, artists that were coming in, approaching the subject matter from very different points of view. That's very exciting. And I think one of the things that really attracted me to this institution is that they have this track record of building a lot of strong community relationships in their work. So in the past, they've worked with, for instance, the South Asian community and made a Bhangra exhibition. They also have done a lot of work working with different artists, indigenous artists, as well as Chinese Canadian artists like Tobias Wong. So there were a lot of moments in which the museum has intentionally tried to broaden its reach to working with different racialized community groups.
Okay, Sarah, maybe I'll have you talk about the exhibitions at the Chinese Canadian Museum.
Okay, well, we've only been open for a year and a half in our permanent location, but you still have just over a month to see our feature exhibition, which is the paper trail to the 1923 Chinese Exclusion Act, a very significant project that marked the grand opening of our museum last July because it commemorates 100 years since the passing of the Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese immigration almost entirely for 24 years. So it's quite an eye opening show that I think I'll be speaking more to later. In our introductory gallery, we just changed the exhibition. So our new one is called Reshaping Collections, where history meets art. And we commissioned 6 different artists from across the diaspora to reinterpret their research in the UBC Chung collection, which is a really neat collection put together by Dr. Wallace B. Chung over the course of his lifetime that features early BC history, the Canadian Pacific Railway, as well as Chinese immigration and settlement. And so we let these 6 artists reinterpret their identity and Canadian identity through 6 new commissioned pieces. So that's a really neat show. And on the 3rd floor, we honor the legacy of the Yip family in the building that we now occupy through the historic period rooms. And it includes one of the oldest schoolrooms in Vancouver.
That's wonderful. Denise, you've focused a tremendous amount of time looking at the history of Chinese pioneers in the region. And I'm wondering, what are some of the most important things you've discovered over the course of your research?
I would say one highlight in working with different generations of Chinese Canadian communities is it's very much a research process that's very tied to healing. I've been working with a lot of different individuals and families since 2009 because there were, in that kind of period, a lot of focus on understanding the experiences of head taxpayers and documenting their experiences, because at that time there were still quite a few survivors who were available to share their stories from a first-person point of view. So working on different documentary projects and later on getting involved in UBC and working with Professor Henry Yu and Sarah and others on the team, broadening the storytelling approach has been very tied to using kind of very oral history approach to connecting with families and learning about their stories. So I've worked in Burnaby Village Museum for 7 years before joining Museum of Vancouver. And one of the things that I was really focused on was building those relationships in the communities and working with individual families to record their stories, help to sometimes digitize photographs, help them to translate some of their family letters. Those are just some examples of the many ways in which we got to engage with the families, but a lot of it has been, I think, very, in many ways, I think it's very emotional experience for a lot of families because of having someone come in and be very interested in their family story and having them oftentimes maybe gather, maybe their children, their grandchildren together and be part of the process of sharing their family stories. I think is very encouraging. We've been able to work on some public talks like this kind of format where we had multiple generations sit together and talk about, you know, their story of their family farm and how kind of their family moved to Canada and share some of the struggles and experiences, and how also the younger generation reflecting upon their grandparents, their parents' experiences are able to kind of tie it to their own experiences of growing up as Chinese Canadians today. So I think in that way, it's been a very rewarding work experience being able to kind of connect and engage with some of these families.
That's wonderful. Lynn, can I ask you, you just had the 10th anniversary, and I'm trying to remember, I know Global Asia's, I'm trying to remember what the title is. Maybe you could repeat the new...
Center for Global Asias.
Center for Global Asias, okay. What, over the past 10 years, what have been its greatest accomplishments?
I would say it's the people who we met, the people who help us to reflect, that help us to do better, and the connection that we build. I think that's the biggest, because we often, like, for the past 10 years, you know, it's funny that when we call institution art, people would come to the gallery and look for the institution. And it was like, well, actually, it's me and my other colleague, Diana. She does the exhibition, and I do public program that activate her show. So it is always the questions that, we think about in the back of our mind. It's that, is the installation art a physical space? Or perhaps not. It's a place where people gather, we exchange thoughts and community engagement, find ways of to build that sense of belonging, and then in exchange have dialogue. So I think that the biggest achievement is the people who still there supporting us and believe that that we are heading into the right directions, and there's still a lot of stories that is untold, and yet to be told. And for me, often when I do public program, I'm always try to think about what can I do to offer a safer space where people feel welcome and they can come share. And I remember when I first joined the gallery, because I do tours in Mandarin on the weekend, and once it was just a mom and her daughter. She was here accompanying her daughters who's going to enroll at UBC at that time. And after the tour, she came to me and then she said, I'm just here with my daughter first time in Canada. Can I have your phone number? And I say, sure, but why? And she's like, I just want to know there's someone there who can speak the same language as my kids. If one day she feel alone, she can come and reach out. And I say she can come anytime. On the weekend, I'm always there. Or she can just come to the reception and ask for Lynn Chen, and I will be there. So that's the moment I realized how important it is to be someone there that they know they can connect to in the institution that it's quite Eurocentric at that time, yeah.
That's wonderful. And so it's Sarah's turn now. And so the mic is going to come down. And Sarah, you were part of a museum startup, which doesn't happen very often. What were the key priorities as the staff were developing the exhibitions?
I think, and this probably echoes a lot of the work Denise and others have been doing over many years, but I think as a new museum, we're fortunate to be in a position where we're not inheriting past mistakes or burdens that other institutions are in the spotlight for. But I think we have a really unique position as like most of our team identifies as Chinese Canadian, and so does our leadership through the board of directors. But I think we wanted to make sure that we were a platform to tell diverse stories. I think a lot of work has been done to educate people about the early Chinese discrimination against Chinese, but we wanted to be a place where we go beyond that minimum narrative that has been spoken about, but to show that Chinese diaspora, Chinese identity building and migrations continue until today, that it's not only the railway, or not only the gold rush that our history speaks to. And I think whenever we present the timeline, I think we always talk about 1788 as that first known arrival of Chinese migrants onto Vancouver Island and the relationship they formed with the local Mowatchot and Muchalat First Nations peoples. So it's sort of reorienting people in terms of the typical maybe sound bites they've heard of Chinese Canadian history, making sure we're not Vancouver-centric. We are the Chinese Canadian Museum of British Columbia, so we want to fulfill our provincial mandate, but also make sure that we're appealing to people nationally as well. And we also want to be intergenerational. Denise talked about how healing these types of spaces can be, and I think we are one of those spaces that people have come to heal to learn more about their identity and their roots, and we want to appeal to the young and the old and everything in between.
Well, that also, you know, when you talk about the province and a very old Chinatown in British Columbia is in Victoria, and you set up a satellite gallery in Fantan Alley, and I'm wondering if you might want to share what that involved and what people could see if they went there.
Sure. Yeah, 2 years ago, I was fortunate to be part of a team that set up sort of a satellite exhibition space in Fantan Alley. And we only just recently transitioned the operations. So it's now called the Victoria Chinatown Museum. But for the first 2 years, it was our satellite gallery. And the leadership in Victoria has always been incredibly hardworking. People like former Mayor Alan Lowe and former Councillor Charlene Thornton-Joe have long advocated for their own permanent Chinese-Canadian museum. And so it was really nice to collaborate with them. Alan was on our board, Charlene was on our staff, and we set up a space where we could feature the long-standing history of Chinese people in Victoria. So they really enjoy telling localized stories. They have great pride in being the oldest Chinatown in Canada, and there is such an amazing history of the early wave of Chinese who first came through the Port of Victoria. So you can still see exhibitions that we co-curated together. There's currently one called Victoria in the Time of Exclusion, so focusing the treatment of Chinese in Victoria during the exclusion era. And yeah, it's a really fun space, and I'm always amazed that on a daily basis they average between 300 to 500 visitors.
Wow.
So there's such a magnet for both locals and tourists, and it's a really fun space that is so different than Vancouver Chinatown. So they're doing really well, and look forward to getting your support too.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Victoria, and I'm very familiar with the Chinatown there in Fantan Alley, if you've never been. It's this narrow little alley between, I think it's Johnson and Pandora, no, Fisgard and Pandora, yeah. And it's a wonderful place to visit. Okay, Denise, your title, I'm curious about your title. It's Curator of Urban Cultures at the Museum of Vancouver. And how is this title, Curator of Urban Cultures, reflected in the operations of the museum? Like I'm wondering what you do exactly in that role.
Yeah.
I know you're a researcher and you're a curator.
It's a very interesting job in that a lot of the work that we do is shaped by the different pillars of our museum. We have a strong focus on environmental sustainability, strong focus on redress and reconciliation. We also look at immigration and diversity. Like all of those come into play in all the work that we try to do. And so specifically in my role, I've only been there for a year, so I've been working on right now a collections-focused exhibition, which focuses on some of the chairs that are collected in the museum's collection. But when I first joined the museum, I got to work on an artist show with Professor Yao Ruizhong from Taiwan. He's a very established photographer, artist, professor, and also very socially engaged in his practice. And so we were able to invite Professor Yao as well as Sandy Lo, who's an independent curator from Taiwan, who's very focused on community engaged practice, to come to Vancouver and to kind of share some of the work with us. But I think some of the work that, because I come from a very strong kind of interest in history and place-based storytelling, so I try to bring in kind of the Vancouver lens to whatever we try to do. So in the case of the Mirage exhibition with Yao Ruizhong, we were able to collaborate with students from UBC's School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture to develop their own content and interpretation on what it means to make better decisions on urban planning and make better uses of public spaces. So as much as I want to be able to define my role in kind of thinking about urban culture, I think it's more about my general approach is very community engaged and collaborative. And I hope that this type of practice can continue on in whichever medium I work, whether I'm working on an art exhibition or historical object-focused exhibition, that these kinds of practices can be carried on. But I will mention that a lot of the work that I've been more engaged in has been about racialized communities, so that has been kind of one of my main focus areas, whereas some of my colleagues are working in areas, for instance, in disability and activism, environmental sustainability, or indigenous reconciliation and repatriation. So we work as a team to collectively tell the story of Vancouver.
I'm also curious because I think both Sarah and Denise, that did you both study under Henry Yu at UBC?
Yes.
Yeah. What did you learn from Henry?
So many things. But I would definitely say a very strong focus on capacity building and engaging with students. I still carry on that in my work because I think it's very important to build up the next generation in all of the work we do, especially in the cultural sector, where we need more folks bringing in more ideas and more, of their values into the space and open up the conversation in a broader way. And because Professor Henry Yu's a history professor who does a lot of work in tying students to, what do you call those? I guess real life projects, like not just projects for the classroom, but he actually places students in work environments that are actually working directly with the city, with policymakers, or working with community organizations to support some of the work they're doing. So I think the work that I've kind of learned is kind of thinking about our work and our role as capacity building, both in terms of training students, but also supporting communities who oftentimes have a lot of great ideas and a lot of good work that they want to do, but they're under-resourced. And so how can we bring students together and connect community together so that there is also that kind of intergenerational learning, both elders who are sharing their knowledge with the younger generation, but also younger generation sharing maybe their technology skills and whatnot to help the elders capture stories or work on different types of publications and projects. So that would be, I guess, one highlight.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll ask Lynn the next question. And Lynn, one of the obstacles in presenting art from Asia, I'm guessing, is that some of your traditional audience doesn't always understand it, or they maybe don't feel as comfortable with it given their history, maybe growing up exposed to Western art. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what the Vancouver Art Gallery is doing to kind of help people's cultural literacy about art from Asia.
Well, I think because for public program, it's kind of, we can be very agile in terms of different than my colleague here, who's doing curatorial work that would sometimes take years to create a show. But for public program, it's because it's public facing, so often I can get instant feedback from the public after hosting a talk or a performance or like art party, etc. And then gathering those feedback that I can tailor pretty much right away another program that's helped to sort of fill that gap, if I may say that, yeah. And range differently too, like from film as well. Like, so it's not just like you come and then attending a lecture kind of way of understanding a culture or sharing stories. Yeah, so it's quite range. Yeah.
Well, I remember one I really enjoyed was your interview you did with Hae-Jin S. Lee, the U.S. academic. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so...
and how it was a companion to
yeah, it was
the
like
exhibition,
2 years ago.
Conceptions of Whiteness.
Conception of White. So that was a show that talks about how the white race was constructed, and I came across this podcast with Hae-Jin Lee, a professor who's teaching at University of Hawaii, and then she talks about how the Korean beauty was sort of formed based on the history of the Korean War leading up to the plastic surgery and then the new like industry and things like that. For the institution, I have a program called In Dialogue. And I always wanted to find ways to bring different perspectives to view our show. And then so I invited her to have a response to the Conception of White programs. Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay. Sarah, I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned this at the outset too, but the history of Chinese Canadians has been intertwined with the history of Indigenous people. And how have the staff been able to address this at the museum?
Well, I think as a new startup, we're at the very, 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 very early stages. Like I personally have been in the field for a while, and it's all about relationship building. So meeting people from our host nations, having those conversations, forming collaborations. I think the museum as a whole, we ensure that we do our part in making sure visitors know that they are on the unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and then building from there. And so in our public programming, for instance, we've done programs with members of the Musqueam community. We've started to have certain topics highlighted on our podcast series that Dr. Melissa Lee hosts. And so recently she interviewed Senator Lillian Dick, who is an amazing leader of Cree and Chinese ancestry. And so the podcast has been another way to open up that discussion. I would love to do an exhibition that really does this topic justice in terms of the intersection between Chinese and First Nations in BC. And so we definitely have a long way to go, and many of our staff still need to take that personal journey. But another thing we've done the past few years is on September 30th, the annual Day for Truth and Reconciliation, is to have a public program and have some of these resources made available that are typically only offered in English into Chinese as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's
but
wonderful.
Very early stages.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. And Denise, the Museum of Vancouver has really been a leader in my kind of amateur museum observer perspective of, being a leader in repatriating artifacts and artworks to Indigenous communities. And I think this is quite a major story that's unfolding here in Vancouver, and I think it deserves a lot more attention. And I'm curious why this has become a priority for your organization, and if you wanted to comment on some of the things that are happening, because I think it's quite exciting and interesting.
Well, the Museum of Vancouver's been around since the 1890s, so it's done a lot of damage to a lot of Indigenous communities, unfortunately, throughout its lifetime, and that is reflected a lot of times in our collections and the way belongings were collected in the past in very violent ways. And we're very fortunate that my colleague, Dr. Sharon Fortney, has been a very strong leader in changing the way the museum's relationship has been with different, both the three host nations as well as other Indigenous communities. So in the past year or so, since I joined the museum, there's been many repatriation activities happening. Some of these take some time because oftentimes there is a process of first presenting an inventory to find out what we have. So that requires a bit of research because sometimes the records of these early acquisitions are very unclear. And so there's a lot of kind of backtracking and research that needs to happen. And then with that, there's also building the relationship with different communities and trying to understand what their needs and their wishes are, because not all communities may want to bring everything back to their own communities. So there's also a conversation that kind of happens on a longer term basis. But in the past year, we've been very fortunate to, I was able to witness a very quite large-scale repatriation to the Chilcotin community. And we've recently been starting to create an exhibition about that, which will be coming out next year in spring. So Dr. Sharon Fortney will be co-curating that exhibition, and it's called The Work of Repair. So it's a really, I think, a very important moment for us to reflect on the long history of the museum and the harms that it has inflicted upon different communities, but also the work that is being done and that can continue to be done to repair some of those relationships and reconnect a lot of these belongings back to communities. So I will just share kind of my experience of witnessing the repatriation process. It's not something that just happens kind of very quickly, but over many years of conversation and finally inviting the community members. It includes elders, some of the younger generation, the youth to come, also some of their knowledge keepers to come and witness. So it was a big group that came, and also it was kind of on a multi-day process. So coming in, and one of their knowledge keepers came to awaken some of the belongings in the collection. So it's a very, very spiritual process where you see these connections slowly becoming revived and reconnected back to communities, and then having all of the belongings set out in one of our learning spaces, and having all the elders and the children come and like look at the different belongings, the baskets, and study them, understand them, and also recall memories, thinking about who were some of the family members that made some of these baskets and lithics and whatnot. So it's a very moving experience, and also in a way it creates that sense of community coming together and being able to collectively reconnect with some of their ancestors via these belongings. Is a very moving process, and I think it's something that motivates all of us at the museum to continue to do this work, not only on the curatorial side, but also on our programming side, because we have also an Indigenous programmer who does a lot of engagement with local Indigenous artists, as well as staff training. We do also have training for staff throughout the year, so that all of us, especially our front desk staff, who often have to directly engage with visitors, to prepare them and to equip them to help them more understand Indigenous ways of knowing and knowledge, so that when the public comes to them with questions, they are more comfortable and more prepared to respond.
It makes me, can I just do a follow-up question here, Denise? It's fascinating, and I wonder, whether your other museums are seeking input from you on how to do this, or whether the museum is even thinking along the lines of publishing anything about best practices on how to engage in this activity, because this is an issue for museums around the world.
Yes, actually, yes. Sharon has published articles like throughout the years, and recently she published one on knowledge repatriation, and that's something that she's been working on as a special project on the side. So not just thinking about repatriating physical belongings, but also thinking about the ways in which we can help community members kind of reconnect with traditional ways of making certain types of crafts and baskets and different types of techniques that they use traditionally. And so I think in that way, there's a lot of resources that can be accessed to kind of learn more about what's happening. And Sharon's often interviewed as well in the media. So recently she did an interview with Gloria Makarenko, CBC. So you can also try to find that podcast episode about that, and where she talks a bit about the work that the museum's doing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Now, Lynn, I'll start with you. I'll ask this question of everyone. You know, nowadays, curation often goes beyond simply just choosing what should be on display. And I'd like to ask what your cultural institution is doing to increase public involvement in that process of what's being put out for people to see, visitors to see.
I think active listening. For me, for myself, I can speak on my work. It's as a public programmer. It's often after work I will go to other events to know what other discourse being discussed out there, or publication I read, and to really finding ways that we can fill that gap. And like Denise say, like our institution also was situated in the former provincial law court, that a lot of BIPOC community don't feel comfortable coming in to the building itself, let alone come to see the show or attend any programs for years. So really, by observing and understand people's need, and then for me, like I try to tailor the programs that it's make people feel more welcome and belong and comfortable by offering, like before, like we have lingual tours that we offers, or ways of engagement through films, etc. For the recent work that I've done with Rural Collective, I noticing them doing street dancing outside of the gallery of Plaza for the past 10 years. They do the dance every Friday outside. And then when I organizing art party, I did a research about some of their previous work, and I invited them to come in and do a response to our Horizon show that time. So like just try to find ways to be an observer and then offer more hospitalities to the community.
And Sarah, I'll ask you, what role are crowdsourcing and oral histories playing at the Chinese Canadian Museum?
Yeah, it's interesting for us because we're brand new. We didn't start off with a collection. We didn't start off with a building where we could instantly borrow things. So there's a term in the museum world called being a Class A facility, where you have your building retrofitted and to the right humidity levels and other conditions to preserve these objects over time. So because we haven't reached that status yet, we're really starting from scratch. And I think in all of our exhibitions so far, you really see the focus on oral history and working with the community to tell their stories, or our stories in our case. And you really see this shine through with the work of Catherine Clement. Again, she is a guest curator whose feature exhibition, The Paper Trail, is on display, and she's also working with us on the upcoming military exhibition that opens in the spring. But Catherine often crowdsources materials from individuals, families all across Canada. She did this for her Yu Cho Chow photography project. And you see this in the paper trail where she has been able to gather hundreds of these Chinese immigration certificates, the most ever publicly on display now at the CCM, but also a very significant now national archive that is housed through UBC Rare Books and Special Collections. But it's because of Catherine's methodology of crowdsourcing, of equipping and building the capacity of everyday people to come in, scan their beloved relatives' certificates and add this to the collection. So really working with the community to share their own collections, to tell their own stories. All of our exhibitions, we realize people really love watching film. On every floor we have documentaries, and I think that's something we're going to continue to do. Even in our latest show, which is a contemporary art show, we sent a film crew into the archive with the artists, because often you only get to view the final product, often at places like the Bag. But it was really interesting to see these artists in the archive itself, to have those moments of excitement and discovery as Chinese Canadians, and then think about, what do we want to make? How do we do this respectfully? So I think
can
that,
you also,
yeah.
for people who might not be aware, talk about the significance of these certificates and what they represent?
So when early forms of exclusion weren't working, such as the head tax, many of you may have learned about the head tax, the Canadian government imposed the 1923 Chinese Immigration Act, more commonly known as the Exclusion Act. And they gave Chinese in Canada exactly 1 year to register. And it was their way of monitoring the activity of Chinese in Canada. And if you didn't register, there were likely fines or other consequences that were faced. But you had to carry this identity card, essentially. And even those who were born in Canada had to register. And despite being born here, they weren't considered Canadian citizens. At the bottom of each certificate, they were told they did not have legal status in Canada. So quite an ironic and very harmful piece of legislation that created a lot of fracturing, separating families between China and Canada, creating depression, many committed suicide, and a lot of these harms are revealed in Catherine's exhibition.
Thank you. Denise, you've used the term relational curating, and that might, some people might not know what that means. Can you explain it?
It's a term that I kind of worked on in my PhD dissertation at UBC. It's really a concept that's borrowed from art history research and art theory, but I'm trying to apply it to looking at more of the work I do in civic museums and working with community, different community groups, and how to kind of create an open space for communities to be participants of what we produce in museums, but also be drivers of the work that museums do. I think there's a lot of good intent for a lot of institutions now to work with racialized communities, but oftentimes it's still very much tied to the institution's existing kind of processes or policies and kind of constructs of how they want to present the story. So the work that I've been trying to advocate through my writing and also my practice is to just really think about ways where we can navigate that relationship that is more equitable and also more of an ongoing conversation to continue, I think both of our panelists here have also shared about the importance of relationship building in our work. And I think as well, being a museum is a kind of a complicated situation. Like there's a lot that we can offer to community groups, but also do we always need to be the ones who are collecting and making the decisions and representing communities? So the great thing about what we're seeing today is that there's more and more racialized community groups that are starting their own organizations and creating their own archives, building their own collections, and also coming up with their own narratives of how they want to self-represent. So how can museums participate in support this kind of network of distributed power where groups can, in their own terms, on their own timelines, like produce work that is representative of how they want to be portrayed to community. So I'm still kind of navigating this, as now I'm working in a very colonial space. But also I think there's a lot of great opportunity because there's so much to be learned from working with my colleagues as well as the groups that I'm, collaborating with on different projects. So that's kind of how I'm approaching that work right now.
Okay. We're going to be inviting questions from the audience. And so I'll just ask a couple more questions, but if you have any, you can think them up. One of the things I wanted to give Lynn a chance to address, though, is Vancouver Gallery Offsite. And that has also been a forum for Asian art. And can you provide an example of an exhibition that might be well suited for the offsite gallery on West Georgia as opposed to, say, inside the building?
Well, the reason one, I got a chance to work with Lenny Maestro, a Filipino artist, and her work's called No Pain Like This Body, curated by Makiko Hahara. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So
Lenny Maestro, yeah.
Lenny Maestro, her piece is called No Pain Like This Body, curated by Makiko Hahara. And that work, what's interesting, it's just a text-based neon sign. And it has two phases. It's called No Pain Like This Body, and the next one next to it is called Nobody Like This Pain. And it was a work that Makiko sort of curated at Center A in 2008. And that time she invited Lenny to come to Vancouver first time for a visit. And because of the neighborhood, she did a site visit in downtown East Side. And that's the phrase that came to her, the words that came to her mind. And then, a decade after, 2018, we brought her work back. However, instead of have the work shown in Chinatown neighborhood close to downtown East Side, but this time was at our offsite, which is outside of Shangri-La Hotel, a financial and then luxury sort of like a district that is so
the rich
different.
people could see it.
It's so different. It's and when I was doing the programming for the talk and for I have a lot of discussion with Lenny and Makiko too. The interesting thing that we positioned that work, and that was doing Christmas holiday as well. And that's also the time we sort of just emerged after COVID. And because the word is so vague, there you can have different kind of readings to it. No pain like this body, whose pain is it? Is it mine? Is it you? Whose pain is it? And at the same time, it's kind of funny because there's an Equinox gym in front of it. So I also wonder, are those people who tried to do the workout thinking, that's for me? Or, but at the same time, with all this crisis that's at downtown East Side, that it's almost like COVID time, hey, we are actually all have responsibility together with this work. So that work sort of opens up by a lot of interesting reflection and a dialogue by situated at the offsite.
Well, I
place.
also read an article. It was a major design firm had put it in the top 10 public art projects in the world of the year. And
Yeah.
so it was, I would say, I always thought it was quite subversive seeing that message in that location.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. Denise, can I ask you a question about why Canadian museums have been slow, maybe that's my perception for the most part, in telling the stories of everyday Chinese Canadians from the past?
I think it's a very complicated issue. I think overall the cultural sector is very under-resourced. And even though there is a lot of desire to put out more of this work, I think especially if we look at museums, I think it depends on how you, which side of the museum you're looking at. Maybe on the curatorial side, there are more challenges because I think, as Lynn mentioned, some of the work takes a lot longer, like planning an exhibition or changing the direction of your collection practices, for instance. Like those things take a long time to change. And so you'll see maybe in those areas, the reflection of these stories takes more time to build, and it's great to have like CCM and other institutions, say in Chinatown and across the country, that are very focused on that work. But I would say though, with programming, as you mentioned, it's very nimble, it's very agile, it can really respond to the moment and be able to really focus on some of the critical issues that are happening in the current moment. And so I think if we look at it from the programming side or even on education side, I know our education team, for instance, does a lot of work as well in delivering programming that's about Chinese Canadian and racialized communities to school children. So on those levels, I think we're seeing a lot more momentum because there's been a lot of government resources invested in those areas, in developing learning resources. And I've been involved in developing many of these resources, both at the kind of city level, but also at the provincial level. So you do see a lot of this work happening, and it's great that a lot of teachers are now very actively engaged and wanting to engage with the heritage of the students that they're teaching, because as the demographics change, they also need to think about what they're teaching in the classroom and whether it resonates with the students. So I've had a chance, for instance, to deliver a presentation to secondary schools teachers that teach social studies and history in high school. And it was very encouraging because one of the teachers provided me with the feedback that after listening to the presentation, he changed his course assignment and asked the students to do a family history project where they would go and interview a family member and learn more about the history. So at the end of the class, he was very excited because he emailed me the film that one of his grade 9 students made. And the grandfather was so excited that the granddaughter was finally interested to learn about the family's migration story, and took the time to visit the cemetery with him and listen to him talk about the family's migration experience. And the student did a wonderful job making this film about the family story. So hopefully one day when this student grows up, maybe they will have an interest in also encouraging people around them to think about the importance of documenting their family story. And I think there's a lot of ways in which museums are doing that work, just maybe at different cadences and speed, but I think it's slowly happening. But obviously if there were more resources, financial support, that would be definitely a huge help to making this work more impactful.
And Sarah, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think, I agree with Denise that it depends on what aspect of the museum sector you're looking at. I used to be more in public programming than curation, but I think it's also worth observing that, like for our staff, we now have 15 full-time staff, a lot of part-time staff, but for most of us, this is our first museum job. And when I went to the BC Museums Association conference last year, like the majority of us were not people of color. So I think there are many institutional barriers, and I don't have the answers as to why, but I rarely see other Chinese curators. I think the same is for Indigenous curatorship. There is still severe issues in terms of representation in the field itself, and that trickles through every department, I would say. So I think we have a long way to go in terms of the resourcing, the capacity building to train up the new generation of Chinese Canadian curators, for example.
That's wonderful. I'm going to pass one of the mics over to Diane, and she's going to go around in the audience and take questions. Anyone who asks a question, it would be on the video, so just to be aware of that. And I can see a great artist in the back row named Jessie Sopal, who is going to ask a question, and Jessie is a phenomenal artist, by the way.
Thank you. Don't have to hype me up that much. I guess my question is, at one point, these institutions didn't exist, and so you had to, have to work with the government to get them built. Just for context, I'm Punjabi, South Asian, and I'm sure you've been aware that the government is working towards building a South Asian museum. When that is, we don't know. We're trying to put pressure, me and this organization I'm working with. So my question is, since these institutions exist, what were some of the challenges, perhaps insights or tips that you would provide to other racialized groups when they're building their own museums? Because I think that will happen, right, with the Punjabi community, South Asian community that's happening. What are some things that you faced working with a colonial institution like the BC government? So what were those tips, insights, challenges, anything that we should be aware of?
And I'll ask whoever wants to answer, raise your hand, and I'll give you the mic.
Yeah, well, there are many layers to your question. But I think from my understanding, there's already quite a bit of internal conversation about where this museum should be and like what would be how do we even define South Asian, or what is the appropriate scope of the work. I think for us, one of the challenges working at the Museum of Vancouver is we are caretakers of the City of Vancouver's collection, but we're actually a nonprofit organization that operates as a museum society. So we rely a lot on government funding for our work to be done. And for good community work to happen, it takes a lot of resources and funding. So I think having a very good fundraiser on your team is very, very important. We're also in the process of hiring a new CEO for our organization because our current CEO, Mauro Becerra, is retiring next month. And he's been such a great leader in helping us to advocate some of the work that we're doing in repatriation and also diversifying the workforce at the MOV. So you want to have a very strong leader that is able to really understand the needs and the vision of the folks that are building that museum at the moment, and having that strong foundation. But as well, I think there's also a good network of folks, and I think building or relying or having that allyship with other groups. Actually, there is a group that is currently led by UBC, and I think is Sharn in your group? Are you from the Museum Liberation Force? Yeah, so she's part of the CASH network at UBC, which is currently trying to build up kind of a network of institutions, but also community organizations that are trying to collectively share knowledge, share resources and expertise. So I think being a part of those kinds of networks will be a very good foundation for the museum moving forward, because This work, it's not, you don't have to start from scratch, and there's a lot of knowledge and experience that other institutions can share, whether it's how to build a collection or how to write successful grants. There's ways in which we can help one another, and I think the intent of this group is to kind of create that support network for organizations who want to build their own kind of infrastructure as your group is doing. So I think just being part of that, and I also know that you're doing a lot of good work in community engagement, and I know there's an upcoming session at the MOV next week as well, so maybe you want to promote that as well to folks more about just kind of bringing more people on board to help, because I think there's a lot of people that are very interested in your work and want to help in different ways.
Yeah, your question is very multifaceted, but I'll just share for whatever it's worth. Like I was the first staff to join the Chinese Canadian Museum Society, and from what I recall, we had a very close working relationship with the province of BC, and that's where we received the majority of our funding to get where we are today, to acquire our permanent location. But they actually appointed full-time staff to work with our initial team. And so we worked very closely with some other staff. I had a very, presently a nice time working with them. And they appointed 2 board members from the province of BC to be on our board of directors, and we still have 1 provincial representative. But I think, luckily for our situation, they were able to commit quite heavily, both in terms of financial resource and that human resource. And so I think we really benefited a lot by leaning on their administrative support during those first 2 years of operation. Like, we didn't have a CEO. It was a really weird structure where I was reporting to someone in the province. So very unusual processes that I think you will also encounter. We didn't inherit any typical museum workflows, luckily, which it provides many challenges but also opportunities. But I think, like Denise said, we also had we still do have a very strong board of directors, and our board chair is like not human. She works more than 40 hours a week, dedicates her own time and resource to this institution. That's Grace Wong. She still does, even though we have a full staff team. So I think having the right leadership that can also hold the province and the governments that you work with accountable is really important too.
I think for us, I echo what Dennis said too, like the resources and funding is always the challenge. And then for 10 years, installation art can only put up so many shows a year, every other year, just because it's only one person working on the show, and I do the public program for that. And then what we're facing is how do we sustain those relationships that we are building? Because if we have a show from Jimmy Yun, for example, then we have the Korean community comes. But then, after the show ends, how do we engage with them afterwards? That's always the challenge we face with resources and funding and the space. And now, and it's just because before, the program was so heavily anchored on exhibitions. But now we sort of changed the way we work. With Shirish Rao, who come from Indian Summerfest, had that festival mentality, be like welcoming people, and then so now we do even more partnership, and not necessarily hosted at the gallery, but we do it outside too. Like for example, at the VIF Film Festival, we partner up with the Chen Centers, and we have Elenice Abonswin's concert at the Chen. And that it's sort of what pays tribute to the previous exhibition that we hold at our gallery. Or for Asian Heritage Month, reach out to the Filipino community and say, you know, I have this space, and what story would you like to tell? What would you like to do at the gallery? So we do it that way, but otherwise it is challenging for having such a limited resources. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name's Adrian Lee, and I've been a volunteer in the museum world, with particularly with the Canadian Canoe Museum, which is dealing primarily with Indigenous watercraft, birch bark canoes, dugouts, West Coast West. And more recently, I've been a volunteer since COVID with the Maritime Museum of British Columbia in their diversity, equity, and inclusion working group. So this has been a really valuable afternoon for me. My question is actually more of a rhetorical nature, but if you want to respond. My forebears came here in the 1800s with the railway and the gold mines and that sort of thing, so I'm third generation. I'm part of I didn't know about this other museum group that's sort of radical, but I'm part of a group, and so this is more of a personal thing. It's not representing either the museums. That I think it may be time to reflect upon whether it's time to retire the term POC, persons of color, and BIPOC, because POC to me is kind of like a euphemism to make it sound like you're not really racist saying colored people. You're flipping it around like short people are height challenged, right? It centers whiteness, because really what we're saying, person of color, is you're non-white. So you don't want to sound racist and say you're not white. You're a person of color. If you talk to anyone from Japan, Korea, China, Vietnam, are they going to say, well, you know, my indigenous brothers, they're redskins, like the Washington Redskins? Me? Oh, I'm yellow. So I don't think I would self-identify as having yellow skin, and therefore, so the whole idea of colorism and basically color coding, if you're this color, you fit in this category. I mean, that's from the 18th, 17th century, based on what? Colonial and, you know, white supremacy, because the white guys are in the top and the black guys are at the bottom, and then you got your browns and your oranges and your greens and your blues and the whole rainbow. So I'm not the first to think of this. Britain, the BBC, before COVID, eliminated the term BAME, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, because you're basically reducing the world's majority of people. There's a lot more people of color out there, the whites and the minorities, right? And you're reducing them to letters. Now, it's a little bit different, I think, for LGBTQ plus 2S, because you want to be represented, you want to be part of the rainbow. But nobody ever asked me if I want to be called a person of color. It was imposed by some academics, and it goes back, actually, the history of it, the experience of particularly people from Africa in America. Because apparently, because I've read this article out of London, when black people outside of North America kind of don't relate to this blackness, you know, so we've retired terms like Negro. That's what I grew up with. And so I guess it's a rhetorical question of, should we question it? Thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone want to address that on the panel?
I think that's a very, how should I say? It's very current in terms of academic discourse. Like, I very much lean towards using the term racialized instead of person of color or, you know, BIPOC. But I think that's still a conversation that's being had in kind of academic discussions. But if you ask me personally, I'm more leaning towards, and I do use the term racialized instead of the other two. Yeah, and I really appreciate that you've brought up this perspective. I think it's still being used. I know in BC Museums Association, they still use, for their group, they call it IBPOC. So I haven't actually talked to the group on kind of what their decision-making was behind the choice of using that term for their programming activity, but that is something that's certainly been approached very differently by different groups. So thank you for bringing that up. It's an important conversation.
If I stand here, I can, sorry. We have a question.
Thank you so much for all the presenters. Excellent kind of opinions and also presentations. I got a question. So, and talking about the Chinese-Canadian history and researchers, and I just wondering whether there's any cooperations, partnerships between you three organizations with existing museums that also promoting kind of reflecting Chinese and Canadian history. For example, Museum of Quesnel, they have a very rich and opponents about the and Chinese history, and also Barkerville Historic Town. So, and I was on the board of Barkerville Heritage Site for 9 years. So, I'm very good in, had a lot of research about the Chinese Canadian history. But what I'm really interested is to try to bring the awareness of a Chinese Canadian history to those populations who are new to this capacity. So my questions for each of you. Thank you.
I have a short answer, so maybe I can start first and then pass it to Lynn and Sarah. So Museum Vancouver is very fortunate to have an ongoing relationship with Taiwan Fest. And I think part of that is to reflect on how do we define Chineseness and Chinese Canadian identity. And I think a lot of that historically has been very tied to like the Guangdong, South China history. But I think there's now becoming more and more of a demand or interest in diversifying that narrative. And so MOV's been very fortunate to work very closely with Charlie, who's here with us from Taiwan Fest, and to build some of those relationships that help us to really challenge and kind of look at the notion of identity through these different angles. And we're very fortunate that I got to participate in the program today and got to chat with some of my colleagues in the industry and hearing also about their work. So hopefully this can also be a starting point for building more relationships, but obviously we do have a lot of ongoing connections. I know there's an upcoming program next year with the CCM for Lunar New Year as well, so we do try to find ways to work together.
Yeah, I think I agree. There's a complexity within even just the term Chinese itself too, right? And then sometimes not even people in diaspora don't associate with certain words. And then I think that's the beauty of like sometimes having a hybridity identity is you can somehow navigate it, different journey, and then reflecting on different perspective to view things. So, yeah.
What's been nice is that even though we're just about a year and a half into our operations, our exhibition, Odysseys and Migration, which is similar but much smaller than A Seat at the Table in that it looks at the Chinese in BC from 1788 to today, will be traveling. And so it is going to the Royal BC Museum in Victoria next year. And then the next year it's going to Barkerville. And what I've noticed being on the exhibitions team is that a lot of smaller museums across BC, ones that I've never heard of, like the Cortez Museum or Princeton, have been reaching out because a lot of these much smaller spaces don't have the resources that we necessarily have, nor the expertise to share Chinese Canadian exhibitions. And so they've been reaching out in hopes that we could give them a traveling exhibition. And so we're in discussions with quite a few. I see that the table recently went to Nanaimo Museum, and that just opened for several months. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to collaborate across BC, which is a huge part of our mandate.
Last call for questions. Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming and for our panel discussion Beyond Chinese, how Vancouver's cultural institutions reflect the diversity of diasporic populations. Please give a warm round of applause for our speakers, Lynn Chen from the Vancouver Art Gallery, Denise Fong from the Museum of Vancouver, and Sarah Ling from the Chinese Canadian Museum. And thank you very much. And if you're interested in Pancouver, it's pancouver.ca. And we have lots of articles in our Beyond Chinese series, which is looking at, showcasing the diversity and the different perspectives of people with Chinese ancestry, whether they're from Malaysia, whether they're from Hong Kong, whether they're from Vancouver, whether they're from Taiwan. I've interviewed Denise and Lynn, so you can read about them and their stories. And Sarah, maybe you'll be next. So, although her boss, Melissa Carmen Lee, was also featured in the series, and she's the CEO of the Chinese Canadian Museum. Anyway, thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And thanks to the VPL.